Point C, Psalms teach us a spirituality of pursuing paradoxes. And this is the paradigm, this is the rubric I'm going to use to talk about and look through the Psalms today with you. I believe that the Psalms often give us opposing or seemingly opposing views of ways to connect with God, ways to relate to God, or ways to understand God. They seem opposing. And therefore, we as in our humanity are tempted to kind of veer towards one side of that spectrum or the other. And as we walk through some of these opposing ideas that the Psalms bring out before us, I would challenge you to start thinking about the ways and apply it and say, which one is my default? Which one do I tend to favor? Which one do I tend to think of when I think of corporate worship, when I think of my own worship or my own relationship with God? And begin to ask yourself if the other side is not equally important. I hope you realize that it is. I hope the Psalms convict us of that. Because in doing so, when you see this spectrum, hopefully you can say, I'm going to be a person that stands in the middle, that pursues both sides of these. And if I know that my default is, in a sense, to favor this one side, I'm going to front load it with this other side. Hi, come on in. No problem. The sheets are right there. Come on in.
I'm sorry.
Don't worry about it. Totally fine. So we're at point C, and what we're basically saying is that as we look at the Psalms today, we're looking at how the Psalms often bring up two opposing views, two opposing things that may challenge us because we may favor one side or the other. So ultimately, my assertion is that utilizing the Psalms for spiritual formations means pursuing the middle path between paradoxes that they present, seeking to make both aspects of the tension a part of how you speak to God and how God speaks to you. And just to be clear, the word paradox, it means basically an apparent contradiction, two things that seem to be contradictory but really aren't. We often speak of paradoxes like things that are held in tension. They're sort of up there. And actually, as a side note, if you've ever studied theology or gone down roads of exploring who God is and what He's about, it is the case that in almost every major theological doctrine, the end of the road is some kind of paradox. You get to the end of the rope and you think that you've figured out God, and it ends up being something where, my goodness, I'm left at this wall where two things are held in tension and they seem to contradict one another, but they don't. This seems to be how God leaves it for us. Think about this. Study the doctrine of Jesus. You know, you're pursuing what Scripture says about who Jesus is. You eventually land at a place where He is fully human and fully divine. And think about how those two are supposed to mix logically, and you realize it's quite a paradox. Not a contradiction, but a paradox. Think about the doctrine of God when we study Scripture, and we start to realize who God is in what He's revealed about Himself. We realize that God is one God, and that He's three persons. Now, how in the world there's another paradox about how those things collide. Or study the doctrine of God in the aspect of His actions, in what He does. And then you run into this paradox that is the archetypal paradox that we all wrestle with in our faith. Divine sovereignty and human responsibility. The fact that God is fully sovereign, that He orchestrates and ordains everything that comes to pass. Scripture seems clear on that. And yet, humanity is responsible. We are responsible for our actions. How in the world does that get solved? Not going to answer that. I'm just going to say that, yeah, come on, like I could. Scripture leads us down the road of these paradoxes. And I think one of the beauties of that is it causes us to continually have an open heart before God and an open heart before one another. I have a hunch that if we knew everything, we'd get arrogant about it. We probably would be even worse than we are toward our fellow believers, our fellow Christians who may believe differently from us. And I think a lot of the aspect of God leaving paradoxes before us are to grow us, to make us love one another, and to work through this thing. One day, we'll stand before God, and we will have this day where these paradoxes, maybe we won't fully understand, but will become more clear. Our faith will be sight. I think it's silly to think that we're going to understand everything about God, even when we approach Him and see Him face to face. But nonetheless, things will be a lot more clear to us. It's very fuzzy for us right now.
Doesn't that make it more believable?
I think so. Yeah. Go ahead and talk about that. What do you mean?
Well, it's our worship of something we have no understanding of. An understanding of what he has accomplished, what little we do understand.
Right.
It makes it more believable, but that creates a lot of paradox in itself.
It does. And here's what this is making me think another train of thought. Here's what I'd encourage us to do with the paradoxes of God. For some, their response to these paradoxes are to doubt and to lose heart and to feel like because God is not understandable fully, that he must not be real. I'd encourage you to take a different road. These paradoxes should drive us to worship, to exalt God. You are way bigger than I can understand, Lord. You are way more huge, and you are way more incomprehensible than I could ever imagine. That puts me in my place before you, and I worship you. I praise you. I see that you're this. I see that you're this. They don't fully make sense to me, Lord. But this is what you say is true, and I trust you, I praise you, and I worship you. Our response to the paradoxes of life and of God should always drive us to worship. And that's what kind of proves a faith-filled life, is that we continually respond to God when we have questions in these aspects of worship, that we worship him. It's pretty important.
I think Hebrew 11:1. Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not seen.
Right.
And I just have that in front of me all the time.
Yes, we cannot see it. We cannot see him. But our faith tells us, not despite our reason, but despite our eyes, despite what we can see physically, that God is real, that he's there, that though paradoxical, there are things we can know about him for certain, and that we can pursue him, and that he relates to us and he connects with us. Thank God for this God. Match this God with any other God of any other world religion, and see if their God matches what this God does. Matches who this God is. How he is so huge and yet so close. In fact, that's one of the paradoxes. So let's jump into the Psalms here. And I haven't necessarily put these in any order, but here's where we're going to start challenging maybe some of our held convictions or held thoughts, because I'm always sifting stuff through the filter of corporate worship anyway. And you all know my heart. You know that I have broad sensibilities when it comes to worship. I've been led to those broad sensibilities largely because of Scripture, largely because of the Psalms and what they've led me to do. And I hope that these expose to you why some of those broad sensibilities should be a part of all of our life, even if we have some preferences to how we relate to God, how we connect with him. So one of the first paradoxes I find in the Psalms is this concept of